Oi, oi, it's your boy, MMA sporting ambassador to Riyadh, Jack Slack. It's the Jack Slack podcast, and we're talking about the UFC in Saudi Arabia, a match made in heaven. Our Saudi overlords fixed boxing, as in made it better, as opposed to fixed boxing, which is what every promoter does every time there's a big fight and the scorecards are all wrong. But now they're here to fix MMA. If you remember, some months ago, there was a big Saudi event planned, and the UFC said, how would you feel about Shamil Gaziev versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik? Could you sell out a stadium with that? And the Saudis said, no. What? And the UFC went into panic mode because no one's ever answered back. No one's ever said that's not a good enough card. So the card went ahead at the Apex. It was one of the worst events of this year, which has been one of the worst years for MMA generally, or UFC MMA generally. So a bit of a mess, but then they came back to Riyadh with an event that actually looked pretty decent on paper. We had Robert Whittaker versus Khamzat Chimaev. We had some other upcoming Russian or Middle Eastern stars on the card. And it was all going swimmingly until Khamzat Chimaev's body fell apart, as it always does. The man is one of the scariest men in the world, and also just trains himself almost to death every time he gets ready for a camp. So yeah, he always does it just before the fights are going ahead. So Robert Whittaker, fair play to him, takes a dangerous, almost unknown fighter called Ikram Aliskerov. I did a big study on him on thefightprimer.com, which you can go and read. And I believe Rob's team did read, but there wasn't an awful lot out there on Aliskerov. He's an interesting character. He's from a known camp. He's part of not just Islam Makhachev's camp, but he was one of Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov's better students. He's a 4-time combat sambo world champion under Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov. And I pointed it out in the article and on the Boycast. He's kind of, when you watch his combat sambo fights, he's kind of in the mold of Fedor Emelianenko, where he's got competent throws and takedowns and submissions, but what he's really doing is turning up and boxing the crap out of a load of sambo guys who don't really know how to box. So I feel like I had a little parlay down. Is it parlay if it's two-part? I had a little two-part accumulator down. I had Volkov to beat Pavlovich, and then I had Aliskerov beating Robert Whittaker, because Robert Whittaker's been looking older, slowing down. I don't particularly like his newer style, the real focus on just 1-2s and tapering everything down to this sort of speed in and out game. But I think I nailed the call on Volkov, and I absolutely screwed the pooch on this fight, because I thought either Rob Whittaker's going to slow down and he's got a dangerous opponent in front of him, or they're going to cancel each other out, because Aliskerov, just like Rob Whittaker, relies almost exclusively on the jab. And when he does his wrestling-heavy performances, it's like, I jab enough that they swing back, and then I duck on their hips. So when I've seen him take people down, it's been easy takedowns off getting them swinging. When I've seen him beat people up on the feet, it's been like people who are shorter than him, people who aren't very comfortable striking. You know, he went to his wrestling like constantly against Denis Tululin, who, you know, while his thing is striking, he's not that great at striking. I think Rob Whittaker would slap the piss out of Denis Tululin on the feet. Whereas many points in that fight, Aliskerov looked like he was desperate just not to be standing. So there was this question mark because Aliskerov, offensively as a grappler, hasn't looked as impressive as perhaps he could. Defensively as a grappler, you know, Khamzat Chimaev tried to take him down, and he did the Islam Makhachev overhook on the fence, dig some knees to the body with your back to the fence, and then hit the throw. And he broke away from Khamzat before Khamzat could take him down. It was quite impressive. So I was asking this question, like, is his grappling better than he has been able to show just because of how he's been fighting? But all of that didn't matter because he came out and Robert Whittaker did a fake or a feint, whatever you want to call it, a false entry. And Aliskerov got on one leg, ready to teep. And I pointed this out in the article. It's like the jab and then this weird teep where he pulls his knee up to his chest, curls himself into a ball and tries to teep you. And someone replied, that's Panic 101. And it kind of is. If you watch his Contender Series fight with Mario, whatever his name was, he does it there. Like Mario, whatever his name is long and tall, and Ikram Aliskerov is clearly uncomfortable with it. And he keeps jabbing in, and Aliskerov will pull his knee up to his chest and try and teep. And it's not really working that well. Also tries to high kick people on the way in. But like lead leg stuff as people come in, that can be useful if Shara Magomedov fought on this card, and I was talking about how he is one of the few guys in MMA who's looking to try and land the left leg to the body as the opponent comes in on him. He throws them from very close range, which is very common in Muay Thai, where you immediately tie up, and if you get thrown to the mat, the referee stands you up. Not very common in MMA, where you're just giving the guy your leg. But getting on one leg as soon as the guy starts coming in and doing it repeatedly as like a reaction, it's kind of like having a flinch that's a bit more technical. It's not really a reaction. It's more like, oh my god, he's coming in. And Aliskerov does this 3 times, and on the 3rd time, Whittaker just steps in and clubs him with the right hand. Wobbles him, follows him to the fence, hits him with an uppercut. Bisping goes, the same uppercut that he got knocked out by Chimaev with, and it's not. The Chimaev one's actually really impressive in its own right because it's a counter. It's an inside slip counter right uppercut, which are very rare. I talked about this in the article because that's there's one guy who was famous for doing it was Gentleman Jim Corbett, and that's back in like the late 1800s. You do not see that punch a lot. But no, it wasn't the same uppercut. It was a dope uppercut, but Aliskerov was covering along the fence. He wasn't opening up with a jab. So Whittaker smoked him, and I think, honestly, great reads from Whittaker, great intensity and aggression from Whittaker, because he probably could have just done like the Darren Till, Kelvin Gastelum, Jared Cannonier performance, the ones that I found kind of dull, where he just has a quota of 7 1-2s around, and then he just spreads them out, sprinkles them through the round, and then that's the end of the round. And maybe there's a takedown in there. 1 takedown every 2.5 rounds. But Whittaker's an interesting guy as a finisher because this is his first one since, I believe, 2016, which is Brunson. Did he finish Jacare? I can't remember, but it's been like nearly 8 years. And he didn't have a whole heap of finishes in the UFC before that, but he did have a finish over Brad Tavares, who's really hard to finish. I think that's Brad Tavares' only knockout loss. And he did that in the first minute as well, so it's just crazy. Oh no, Brad Tavares lost his last one by knockout, but that's 2 in like 24 UFC fights. No, he did finish Jacare by the head kick and punches. But still, 7 years, 8 years. Really happy for him. I think there's going to be a lot of writing Ikram Aliskerov off as, not that good. I think it was a bridge too far. And also, both these guys are doing it on short notice. There is with Aliskerov, and there was someone else on this card too. I think it was Tricoli. They were supposed to fight a week earlier. And if you're doing a weight cut and you're trying to peak athletically for a certain date, that's really tricky because you're basically saying, like, you subscribe to all the sports science, you pay these coaches to get you in the best shape of your life and to taper your training down and to get everything ready specifically for a date. And then because the UFC have said, like, we can't do that, can you do this? And you obviously want to get paid, 1, and 2, don't want to make a fuss. You agree to that. You're basically saying all that stuff that I believed in a minute ago, that's worthless. You're just ignoring all the science of peaking someone for athletic competition. And this is true in like any athletic competition. Like if you've got a power lifter who was getting ready for a meet and then you move the meet back a week, they would be pretty unhappy. So there's always that element there with these last minute move around fights. Daniel Cormier said something during Naimov versus Felipe Lima, which might have been the standout performance of the night. He said something on air, which I think he probably shouldn't have said from the UFC's point of view, but he said, it's a good thing that Felipe Lima took this short notice fight because if you're not going to fight on Contender Series and you won't come in at short notice, there isn't a way for you to get into the UFC now. Which is really like part of what's wrong. Contender Series is a 6-6 payday. And people like, European champions like George Hardwick in Cage Warriors have to do that to get in. But then you've got guys like Vartanyan, who's been paid, I think he won €800,000 for a tournament in ACA. And they're saying come in through the Contender Series on a 6-6 contract, and then we'll give you a 12-12, 20-20, whatever it is after that. It's like a job interview where you're paid for your time, but in the most insulting way. And at that level, it's also asking you to do a camp and fight basically for free. So there's a bit of like, damn, Rob looked really good. Would he have done that to Khamzat Chimaev? I mean, they're different fighters, obviously. The reporters were fucking terrible last night. They were trying to get beef going between Volkov and Pavlovich after the fight. They were asking Rob Whittaker, So this guy's like, obviously you were supposed to fight Khamzat Chimaev, much harder fight, and you might have lost. But how do you feel? And Rob Whittaker just laughed and was like, if my auntie had wheels, she'd be a wagon. It's just such a stupid fucking question. But it is the great, I don't want to say equalizer. It's the random chance. Is that what it is in Monopoly of fighting? Because these are, you want to see the best fight the best, and you want to see them get their 8 weeks prepare for each other, be on top condition. And when that happens, that's amazing. When you get two fighters fighting for a world title at the peak of their athletic conditioning, everything's gone fine through camp, they're all ready. They'll probably have nagging injuries, but just the normal kind. That's the best that this sport gets. But a lot of the time, it's not like that. A lot of the time, you have to take short notice replacements and you have to make do. And it's not like we had 8 weeks to train for Ikram Aliskerov and his habits. We had a week to work out what Ikram Aliskerov does. And on the other end, of course, Ikram Aliskerov has a week to change from, who was he fighting the last time? Not someone particularly important. Yeah, he was fighting Tricoli, who's not very good. And he had to fight Rob Whittaker, who is very, very good. But I do think the guy who's more unknown normally benefits from those sort of matchups. Those sort of last-minute changes. Because Ikram Aliskerov could be following the sport fairly casually, and he'll have seen Rob Whittaker fight. Probably quite a few times. Rob Whittaker probably had no idea who this guy was, and he was fighting on the same card as him. So the other half of the fallout of that breakup of the main event was that Sharamagomedov ended up fighting... Oh, sorry, there was another thing that went on here. Sharamagomedov was originally supposed to fight Joylton Luterbach, another nobody from the Contender Series. I think another drug test failure. Can't remember. He failed this one due to a drug test failure. So he came for his UFC debut and failed the drug test. But Tricoli failed the drug test off Contender Series. So his Contender Series win was a no contest. But the UFC's just getting desperate now. So they're scrambling to get anyone they can. So Sharamagomedov lost his opponent in Luterbach, but he gets Tricoli, who was obviously without an opponent because Ikram Aliskerov moved into the main event. And Ikram Aliskerov and Sharamagomedov, I wrote articles about both in the last 2 weeks. Sharamagomedov, I said I really like him. I like his striking. I like his kicking. No one kicks that much, that frequently and confidently, especially above that weight in MMA. But the man walks himself to the cage quite a lot. When he gets against the cage, he circles in one direction. He never direction changes. If you watch Israel Adesanya get stuck against the cage, not so much against Sean Strickland, where he just sort of looked a little bit confused generally in that fight. But if you watch when he was fighting people who were trying to corner him, like Costa, Yoel Romero, Jared Cannonier, he starts circling one way, he changes direction, comes back the other way. Maybe he does it again. He fakes one way, goes the other way. Watch Eddie Izzard. Watch Eddie Alvarez in any of his fights where he gets cornered. RDA is a good example. I think he got hurt and cornered, but he starts going one way. The guy starts swinging. He goes back the other way. You want to go when your back is to the fence and you are in a position of disadvantage. But if you start circling one way, the guy's going to try and intercept you. So you've got to get him to start moving ahead of you, and then you circle back the other way. Or if you get him to swing at you as you're going that way, you can duck under, but obviously there's a lot more risk there. I'm a big fan of using body kicks to cut people off because they can't duck under them. But when Sharamagomedov hits the fence, he just circles in one direction, normally to his right. And if you watched him against Bruno Silva, basically what saved him was Bruno Silva being a bit scared of him. Bruno Silva would get him to the cage, and then Sharamagomedov would go, I'm going to flying near you, and he'd half-heartedly jump, and Bruno Silva would run back to the center of the cage. It was really bad. But when Bruno Silva did bite down on his mouthpiece and step in, Magomedov was trying to kick with his back to the fence, and that it means that he can slot the left leg in underneath your right arm, which is a great counter and it's really effective at winding people, but it means he's standing there on one leg with nowhere to go, nowhere to lean back, nowhere to fall back to if he brings his leg down. So he's getting hit in the face with straight right hands and left hooks. And that happened in round one of this fight. Tricoli backed him up, started swinging at him. Magomedov gets on one leg and tries to kick, gets blasted in the face, gets clinched up along the fence. And Tricoli did quite a good job in the early going of making that happen a couple of times. And Magomedov used the overhook and the kickstand, I think Daryl Christian calls it, using that knee inside, which is it's quite cool because it's an MMA technique for wrestling, but it's also very closely linked to Muay Thai because in Muay Thai, if you watch someone like Superlek when he fought Muay Thai. Muay Thai is an amazing elbow fighter. And anytime he came close, Superlek gets his hands inside Muay Thai's biceps and he puts his left leg, his lead leg, like shin across Muay Thai's belly, and he stands on one leg. So the two of them make a tripod. There's 3 feet touching the ground and one leg is up on Muay Thai, keeping them together, but also keeping them apart. And you can use that in cage wrestling to stop the guy from dropping on a double, stop the guy from closing into the body lock properly. And what a lot of guys do is that they then pass it, they try and get 2 hands on one. They give up the whizzer and they go 2 hands on one. But Magomedov was pretty happy just holding the whizzer and using the kickstand. Got some of his kicks going. Basically, the end for Triccoli was when he got tired, which was about round 2. And round 3, he comes out and he lunges for a takedown. And this is what's happening in every one of Sharon Magomedov's fights. When guys attempt bad takedowns, he brings his lead foot back, squares his stance, drops his hips back, drops his hands on the back of their head. And as they come up out of their bad shot attempt, he's holding a double collar tie, hits him with a knee. Sometimes 2 or 3. Stuns Triccoli, takes him to the fence, knocks him out with his hands or TKOs him. Really flagrant fence grab in this fight. So Magomedov's career in the UFC continues in a way where it's like some of the things he did were impressive. The kicking is really impressive. Other stuff, like how he won and against who he won, was not impressive. It's going to be something we talk about with Renat in a minute. It's like, yes, you're getting the wins. That will give people some hype about you, but people who watched the fights and aren't just tuning in now and being like, oh, look at his record, will know and go, well, he didn't look great there. Co-main event was Sergey Pav versus Alexander Volkov, and I think I got the read on this one right on the Boydcast. I said they trained together quite a lot from what I've heard, and the thing with big hitters is that a lot of the time people like Sergey Pav and Francis Ngannou and anyone who's like a monstrous hitter and gets a reputation for it, particularly at heavyweight, a lot of it is the shock in the early going of their speed and their power, and if you train with someone and they're not throwing full power, you get to see what they're doing, you get a read on their timing, and you get to go, right, oh, he caught me there, right, I'll look out for that next time. And you get to build up, you get to Piotr Yan download the data, but you don't get to do that if the first time you meet someone, it's a knockout or be knocked out scenario, and they're just going ham from the opening bell. If you train with someone for 3 years, and in training, people have to spar a bit more carefully. You know, you're not going to be knocking out your training partners unless it's like hard sparring right before the fight. But most of the time, you're not doing that. So there isn't that risk of being knocked out, and you're not supposed to knock out your training partners. So any like technical sparring, anything less than like hard as hell fight prep sparring, you're going to be trying things, you're going to be showing things, and what will happen is that you will see how many or how few ways Sergey Pavlovich can set up his hands. And when you watch this fight, there weren't many. And Volkov seemed like completely unfazed by all of them. It really was just jab and run up into the right hand a lot of the time. So Volkov had seen it all before, and then also he brought new stuff where apparently he didn't spar in their sparring sessions. He sparred orthodox most of the time. He was southpaw for most of this fight, which makes Sergey Pav's right hand longer, provided he doesn't slip down the outside of your lead foot. Makes his jab harder to get to if you're palming on his lead hand. And it also means that lead leg side kick can be used as a check just on his front leg whenever he starts to step in, because he needs to get in range to do it. You can't punch someone effectively and leave your lead leg where it was. You've got to go to the guy. So you don't need to like stomp on their lead knee. You just need to put your foot on their leg and not let it move forward. And that's what, and Volkov was doing that a lot, and he'd put his foot on the lead knee and then fall down onto the jab. That worked really well. The odd left straight. He'd switch to orthodox and he'd start throwing like a front kick with his lead foot up the middle. Very Kyokushin stuff, which I think was his background originally. Very shilty, semi-shilt. But yeah, if you watch this, if you remember when we were talking about Tyson Fury versus Usyk, I talked about a little bit of like fairly basic footwork that Usyk does that is very important to getting in on much taller men. So when you jab, your lead foot goes forward. And then if you're throwing a 1-2, your rear foot comes up when you throw your rear hand. And a lot of fundamental footwork is like left hand moves, left foot moves, right hand move, right foot moves. There are other forms. You can do sort of charging footwork where you throw with your left hand as your right foot steps and you run on a line, but that's a little bit reckless for boxing. But what Usyk does is he takes 2 foot moves he throws a 1-2, but he takes 2 foot movements on each punch. He's a southpaw, so he goes jab, lead foot, rear foot, and then he goes cross, lead foot, rear foot. So there's a double expansion and contraction of the stance, and he makes a ton of distance. And if you go watch the Tyson Fury fight, a lot of the like overhands and long left straights that Usyk was able to get in on Tyson Fury were because he was doing this double step or double step, because there's 4 foot movements to 2 punches. And it's one of those things where you could go like, I'm sure if I wrote an article about it, some boxing nerd would be like, oh, getting tied up in a very basic technique there, Slacky. But you do see fighters not doing it all the time. You do see fighters not able to do it, and you do see fighters who attempt it and are very slow at it. Usyk's brilliance is that he can do it, and he can do it real quick. And it doesn't take him he doesn't take a pause, he doesn't think, he just does it, and it's beautifully smooth, and it looks so smooth that you don't even notice it a lot of the time. Whereas Sergey Pav in this fight was going jab, and then he wants to throw his right hand, so his right foot comes up level with his left. He leans forward at the waist. That's when he starts doing the wacky, wavy, inflatable arms guy in every other fight. If you watch his fights with Blades, whoever the fuck else he fought, it's just like jab, step level with your lead foot. Like he brings his feet to level and starts swinging. And he couldn't do that because he'd throw his right hand as long as he could with his feet level, and he'd be nowhere near Volkov. Now, Volkov's height and length saved him a little bit there, but also Volkov's movement and footwork. And basically in this fight, I said on Twitter, but he pulled down Sergey Pav's pants and showed everyone his footwork, and it was very embarrassing. Yeah, I mean, that's what it is. This guy knew Sergey Pav, so he was familiar with the tempo that he was going to come at. He wasn't going to be stunned off the bat. And the moment that he started saying, like, come on, Sergey, you've got to do a little bit of work to get to me, Sergey had nothing. And at the end, Sergey was really mad about it. It was kind of sad, this fight, because they knew each other from training camp, and they trained together for like, one of them said 2.5 years, one of them said 3 years. They were sparring partners, and they trained each other for some pretty big fights. Pavlovich helped Volkov train for Derek Lewis, apparently. And coming up to this fight, both of them were like, oh, I didn't want to take this fight. The UFC made me take this fight. And apparently the UFC told both of them that the other guy said, yeah, I'll fight him, before they'd even said it and before they'd signed the contract. So the UFC played them off against each other. And it's kind of sad because like they got on stage for the stare down and they were arguing who said who would take the fight first. Like they were going, I didn't say I wanted this fight. You said you wanted this fight. It was really sad. Like these two guys who were bros and just got played into fighting each other in a division that didn't really need like this particular matchup to happen. But at the end, yes, Volkov went over to like shake his hand, and Sergey Pav was really pissed about it. And then the reporters afterwards were like, what will you do if he tries to make something of it in the hotel or follows you back to your room? And Volkov, being a normal and quite funny person, was like, I'll call the police. But then you realise they're in Riyadh, so it's bad to lose a fight. It's much worse to lose your passport and end up building stadiums for the next big boxing event. Anything else on this card? Mohamed Naimov versus Felipe Lima. Probably the most important fight. Felipe Lima, this is really interesting, came in on short notice against Naimov. Someone said to me, if you had ChatGPT do your scouting, he would be one of the top recommendations. And then they proved it because he fights out of All Stars, which is the big European gym, despite being Brazilian. Maybe that's what Johnny Walker should do. Go somewhere that's not Dublin. But very promising fighter. He lost his professional debut and then has just not lost since. Fought in Brave CF, Octagon, basically everywhere. Comes out against Naimov and has Naimov like grabbing overhook clinches and trying to work from there. Loved his body shots. Loved his... he did a great move where he goes right front kick to the face. Orthodox, he goes right front kick to the face, which immediately gets whoever you're fighting to back up. And he steps forward with it, but he pauses just long enough that Naimov starts stepping back in, and then he teeps him with his now rear leg, left leg. So he steps into southpaw and then throws a southpaw left teep straight into the solar plexus. Loved it. Great move, stealing it. Yeah, he had Naimov trying to tie up in ways that just were not good. He's like smashing in head. Lima would keep his guard very tight, so Naimov would try and box into a tie-up. And all he'd be able to do is like put his head against Lima's and try and overhook the arm, which is about the worst kind of tie-up you can try and get if you want to wrestle the guy to the ground. But the first 2 rounds were pretty competitive. And then Felipe Lima in his corner, his coach goes, you're doing rubbish. Think what your mum would think. Do it for your mum. And the guy comes out with new vigour. immediately takes Naimov down along the fence, jumps on his back, gets the rear naked choke. Just a complete, I think probably because he'd been striking for most, or he'd been trying to push the striking, and Naimov had been trying to push the grappling. By coming out and attacking the grappling in the third, he probably surprised Naimov a bit. The commentators were saying like, oh, if he's going to finish it, he's got to do it on the feet. So yeah, I mean, he was really promising. He was really promising. In with a good guy who, even though he cheated his ass off in his last fight and should have lost because of all the cheating against Nathaniel Wood, he did go the distance with Nathaniel Wood, and that's a very good experienced fighter. So Naimov is good. And Felipe Lima to come in and do that on your first UFC gig, very impressive. And he was doing this up at featherweight because it was short notice. He's actually a bantamweight who has fought as low as flyweight. So to see him in his natural rank, this is the other thing about like having to come in at short notice. So many dudes now have this story where they came in at short notice, lost their first UFC fight because they had to do it in not their weight class. Benoit Saint-Denis had that ridiculous fight against Zaleski at welterweight. Benoit Saint-Denis is a career lightweight. And obviously when he was fighting a lightweight with a proper training camp, he's world class. The yang to the yin, or the good to the evil of Muhammad Naimov is his Tajiki brother, Muin Gafarov. Gafarov, I find him fun. I thought he was fun in his UFC debut. Again, another short notice one. I think Naimov did the same thing, short notice. Came in, fought like a wild man, just running forward at the guy and trying to spin kick and wing overhands. But this one, he looked pretty measured. He did keep attempting takedowns and pulling himself into bottom position, which was not smart. But man, his right hand to the body coming forward. We were talking about this with national boxing styles in like the 40s and 30s a couple of weeks ago. Someone was asking about that. But the right hand to the body on entry is such a good punch, especially if you're smaller than the opponent, if you're shorter than the opponent. When they throw their jab, head to the inside of the jab, right hand underneath their jab. Because everything on that side opens up. If you hit the floating rib, that's going to hurt. No real muscle around the floating rib. You can get the solar plexus, but you're normally aiming like under the arm. Gafarov was throwing a hook rather than a straight, but then you come up with punches to the head afterwards. It's a great entry. And Gafarov at one point did body, head, run up into low kick, which was gorgeous. In the last seconds, he wheel kicked Kang against the fence. His striking just looked gorgeous, except he was trying to grapple for large portions of this fight, which was like the only place that Kang was having success. Kang did some good stuff from butterfly guard. Kang's guard passing looked good. Gafarov's grappling was very interesting because in some regards you'd go, oh, that's not good. That's a really bad idea tactically. But it also had sort of the air of Arman Sarukian versus Islam Makhachev, where he's doing weird things that really did make Makhachev struggle to keep up. Like, you know, we're always talking about Sarukian does like a butterfly sweep to just get Islam Makhachev's hips up and feet off the floor, and then he dives down, reaches in between Makhachev's legs, and comes up on a single with his head on the outside, which is like putting yourself in a crucifix, putting yourself in a switch, putting yourself in a, well, you could end up in the crackdown, but you know it's threatening your own back basically. But it is something that makes movement happen, and if you can stand up with it, you can start trying to take them down off it. And Gafarov's bottom game was like that. He would just sit up, reach down, grab a single with his head on the outside, as opposed to going all the way through to the other leg, and start doing things from there. And he almost gave up his back quite a lot, but he also made stuff happen and improved position. He didn't get stuck there getting hit. Whenever he got mounted, which happened a couple, maybe 3 times in this fight, which is not good. You don't want to be mounted once in a fight, to be honest. To be honest, if you get mounted once in a fight, that's too many. But he kept doing that thing where you bump your hips a little bit and then you dig one hand underneath your opponent's legs, which is like giving them the attempt at the mounted triangle. But a mounted triangle is difficult to finish unless you keep the guy still and get your legs in position the right way. If they're bucking and they're using their arm under your legs to like uppercut your butt and throw you over their head, that can be really useful for getting out. Jamal Hill did that to Glover Teixeira. Glover Teixeira, best mount in MMA, multiple-time ADCC grappling veteran, very, very good. Jamal Hill ends up underneath him, bucks his hips, digs an arm through like he's not supposed to, and shucks Glover up over his head. It's like on this card, I think it was Josie Aldo pointed this out on Josie Aldo, Twitter account, not Jose Aldo, pointed this out on Twitter, but there was a guy who was inside control and walked his way back into half guard because it's better to be controlling the guy's hips in MMA. MMA MMA grappling and grappling are not the same thing. And fighters like Gafarov and Sarukian really remind you of that. My boy Nicholas Dalby put on a performance against Rinat Fakhretdinov, another second fight in a row where Fakhretdinov has been saved from a loss because Zaleski beat the piss out of him, aside from like the first round, and they gave that as a draw. But his stock dropped massively, Rinat, from that fight. And Nicholas Dalby did his old vet thing. I'm bloody loving Dalby's recent run. His last one against Bonfim and the 3 before that, I think it was, he was in the UFC, and his little Cage Warriors run in between being in the UFC. But he's striking with volume and variety on the outside, so he's throwing like 1-2 high kick, calf kick, up and down the body. And then before his opponent can come back, he's crashing in head to chest or head to neck or head to jawline and throwing clinch elbows, clinch knees, really wearing on Rinat. And his takedown defense looked good, got up every time. His wall walking looked excellent. I might have been Miguel Cass, might have been Josie Aldo. You know, all these Twitter accounts I'm always shouting at who have great clips after fights, but showed the switch he hit when the guy was going on when Rinat was on a double leg along the fence, and Daniel Cormier was saying, "Oh no, you can't do that. You can't hit you can't hit a switch on a double leg. You can only hit a switch when they're attacking a single leg." And out in the open, that is true. But what Dalby came off was that reversed sprinting position along the fence. We talked about this a while ago because Conor McGregor was doing it against Nate Diaz back in like 2016. Dominic Cruz was doing it through his, maybe not his WEC run, but his UFC run. When you are on the fence, when you are the guy defending takedowns on the fence, you spread your feet wide into that. So you don't spread them wide like the splits. You spread them wide and you turn to face one direction so that you're in like a sprinting stance. And your feet are wide so that the opponent can't just lock his hands around your butt or pick up both legs. He has some work to do. And you fight his hands the whole time. It's not just you spread your feet wide and he can't take you down, but you spread your feet wide and you're fighting his hands and you're in that long sprinter stance. But if you switch it over, hard to describe, but you'll know it when you see it. But yeah, you have your feet reversed. And it means that if you started running along the fence, like running a circle next to the fence, the leg that's on the fence side is behind you. And the great thing about that is that you can take a big step and start running out. And that's what people use it for. But it also means you can like run into that switch on the double. So Dalby did that, and that was really cool. Managed to make a scramble and get out. I think Rinat is exactly what I was saying about like Sergey Pavin and big hitters like that. In the first round, they are not only big hitters, they're very fast, and that's scary because, you know, a big element of power, if you're not massive, is speed. You've got to accelerate those punches. So they catch people by surprise. But if you've got no boxing smarts or setups or anything else, by round 2, your striking is really not, like, there's a massive drop-off because you weren't tricking people. You were just catching them because you were fast. Round 2, you can't just come out and be completely honest because you're now slowing down. And then by the third round, Rinat was just throwing straight arm swings and looking shit. So he was hyped because he's got the Dagestani beard and he's Russian, even though I think he fights out of Moscow, not Dagestan. But I think anyone who's seen his fights now will know that he's good, but not that good. There's got to be some work done if he's going to be anything special. Haqparast versus Gordon was great fun. Lovely, dirty boxing. And a real... I always say, like, the best fights have, like, a story where guys adapt and try and change what they're doing. If you both start doing the same thing and one of you gets the better of the other, that's just the whole fight then, from then on, if the other guy doesn't adapt. But when they're adapting, it makes those swings in momentum. And Nasrat Haqparast was looking real fast against Jared Gordon, landing his southpaw left straight, landing a left uppercut when Jared Gordon ducked in to try and pick up a single. Jared Gordon was trying to push him to the fence with a single and dirty box, and it was all good stuff, but he was getting caught because Nasrat Haqparast was reading him and was much faster. So Jared Gordon, who's orthodox, goes southpaw and starts jabbing southpaw. And maybe southpaw isn't his best stance, but Nasrat Haqparast is always southpaw and always fighting orthodox opponents and was really thrown for a loop. So Jared Gordon's throwing his like 5 out of 10 southpaw jab, but it's good enough to land on Nasrat Haqparast. And by the second and third round, he was actually doing some real damage on Haqparast and lovely clinch boxing exchanges. I did not see Jared Gordon becoming one of my favourite sort of strikers, but because he is such an effective clinch striker, that really tips me over the edge. I'm like, oh, good dirty boxing, yes please. Haqparast, I do like, he looked a lot faster than I remember him being, and he still has that weird tendency to throw his shoulders like way forward of his hips when he throws his left hand, so he can't combination punch that well. in that once he's thrown his left hand, he can't throw his right hand again very well. But he was using the double jab and the jab and landing counters and looking at where Gordon was going and throwing two there. The uppercuts were a real treat in this fight. He's improved. It's just there are still some things. The thing about throwing your shoulders forward of your hips like that, McGregor used to do it too. It's not good for combination punching. But in MMA, if you throw your rear hand and you keep your hips back, if the guy ducks under your lead hand, if the guy ducks under your punch, you're in better position to try and throw your hips back and sprawl, which happened a couple of times in this fight. And then anything else? Volkan Ozdemir knocked out Johnny Walker. Yep, I mean, this was actually was this one of two knockouts on the card by punch? Because it's amazingly low now, the knockout ratio, since the new gloves came in. I don't know, someone said they switched back for this event, which I feel like the UFC wouldn't do out of pig-headedness, but if they did they wouldn't say anything about it, so I'm kind of split on that. I don't believe the new gloves are magic or have too much padding or whatever. I mean, they're an ounce lighter, aren't they, than they previously were? But what I am still interested in the idea that if these fighters haven't been training with these for very long, if they were given out 2 weeks before the fight or you only got them for the fight, I could see if they make it hard to clench your fist properly, affect people's knockout ratios and ability to hit hard. I think it'd be interesting because if you keep these gloves, I can see people, if the gloves are an issue and you keep them, I can see people just working their way around it. They might find new ways to wrap their hands, put more padding around the wrist, whatever, so they can throw with more confidence. But it is very funny that the knockout ratio has just gone off a cliff. I was saying that PFL should just rebrand as the MMA organization with knockouts, because it's been really noticeable in the UFC that there just haven't been many recently since these new gloves came in. Did like that Ozdemir scored the knockdown orthodox, switched to southpaw for the finish because he saw Walker ducking down to that side. Really nice stuff. Johnny Walker, always comedic ragdoll effect on him when he falls down, but yeah. And Kelvin Gastelum versus Daniel Rodriguez was about what you'd think that fight was. I watch Kelvin Gastelum fights to see people take him down because I want to see him do cool rolls, but this was just stand up. Kelvin Gastelum missed weight by a massive amount because he's massively unprofessional. Daniel Rodriguez has looked pretty bad for a while now, but man, did he look old. He had the hair. He had the hair from when Ray Robinson made his comeback at 40 and just looked terrible. Don't know what was going on there, but man, it was an okay fight, but kind of shit for Rodriguez because he loses this fight now and Gastelum gets a win, but he shouldn't have because he missed weight by a giant amount. There was a Bellator on this week. I only watched the main event. Oh no, I watched Paul Hughes get a win. That was quite fun. But main event, Dagestani Bogeyman pops out and shows Jason Jackson who he is. It was a bit of a slow fight. I did like Nurmagomedov's elbow on the break. He had a really nice one of those. He'd get the underhook on one side, and then Jackson would take the overhook on that side, and Kuramagomedov would reach underneath and grab the wrist like Islam Makhachev often does to set up that trip. But then he would push off an elbow instead. Worked really well. Jason Jackson's takedown defense looked pretty good through the first 3 rounds, I think it was. The really funny part of this was that Conor McGregor was there because they were in Dublin, and they just showed Conor McGregor's reaction for the entirety of the first 3 rounds. They just had a McGregor camera in the corner, which looks so small time. And then at the end of the fight, they got Conor McGregor in the cage to interview him about his fight that he just cancelled in the UFC. It's like, you're supposed to be the competition, mate. You're not mentioned on UFC broadcasts. If Michael Chandler's on, it's like he was a champion in another organization for many years. They don't even say Bellator most of the time. Desperate shit. And then there was a PFL card, which I haven't watched yet, but it had Clay Collard and Mads Bennell in the main event, so I am looking forward to watching that. I'll talk about that on the Boycast. There was a Flow Grappling Who's Number One event. Gordon Ryan came back. I thought his opponent actually looked pretty good, given what people were saying about him beforehand and afterwards even. People were just selling this guy completely short. I thought he looked decent for a big guy with only a few years as a black belt competitor. But again, we'll talk about that on the Boycast. If you've not read the Ikram article and the Shara Bullet article, they're both worth a read and they're free and they're on thefightprimer.com. I'll link them in the description on the YouTube. If you want to get in on the Boycast and all the extra stuff, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And that's all my plugs. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Sinead Kavanagh getting dropped to deafening silence in Dublin. Bless. Oh, also the Saudi crowd sucked, by the way.